This is going to be a really interesting conversation. Systems analyst and researcher Danny Wilten is here this evening, and you're doing some very original and thought-provoking work, my good man. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Niles. Thanks
Yeah,
for having me on.
yeah. Your work. So the work that you do is with mainly imagery with human anatomy, ancient architecture, imagery of Renaissance art, which of course was quite a high period in humanity, and I think I oftentimes think a much higher period than we're at now with our Taco Bells and our Kentucky Fried Chickens. But the another aspect of your imagery that you do a lot of analyzing with is celestial imagery of the cosmos, kind of working to unlock the ancient mysteries.
Yes.
And a lot of your stuff is very thought provoking and helping kind of crack the code that there is more to the fabric of our reality than what we think. And, there's more to layers of reality and kind of the fabric of the universe, and or maybe a multiverse, I should say. So it acknowledges kind of one of the things I really like about your stuff, man, is you kind of acknowledge the good sides and the bad sides of both science and religion. Most science is good, and are aspects of science which are behind what some of these esoteric teachings can tell us if you're willing to really look at them with a fine tooth comb. It's not in any way to be anti-scientific or any way like irrational or cater to kind of pseudoscience, but it seems fair to say that what you're doing is kind of another tool in the deck for science to use. And finding a religious person who isn't dogmatic or is willing to explore new ideas without having
Yeah, and
blinders on.
that whole idea about dogma, that is true for religion and for science as well.
That's true. I think of things like in ancient Hawaii, if you stepped on the king's shadow, they would, run you through. Or in the Middle Ages, if the king didn't like you, he'd just simply have your head chopped off. So that was,
Right.
of course, the time when church was ruling and everybody was subservient to that. But you have nice aspects to bringing people together and communicating good ideas. I know somebody that goes to an agnostic church where it's very open minded, and half the people there are gay, and so they really enjoy kind of that coming together element of it. But one thing that I really find fascinating about it is you're willing to kind of look at both sides of it and really get into the not necessarily seem like you come at it with being indoctrinated either way, but looking at the good sides of each of it. So what's your background, man? I mean, how did you kind of get into this? I know that you said you kind of stumbled upon it by accident.
Well, I'm okay. My background is a systems analyst, so that means I analyze everything. So,
Yes, right.
and I stumbled across. One day I would happen to be looking at this kind of stuff, and I noticed that on YouTube there was a lot of both sides of the coin. You have the really scientific side, and you have the really religious side and stuff. And the really religious folks, and when I say religious, I really don't like that term because it's not really. I would have to say the folks that are indoctrinated or the dogmatic folks, the ones that are tied to a specific thing and they're not willing to look at anything else, right?
Right.
Well,
Yeah,
the
the language is very
problem that I
important.
saw is that all of these people, they seem to be arguing back and forth with each other about what the meaning of a particular text had to say. And I noticed that this happened a lot. We take a look in Genesis where they talk about the Nephilim and all this kind of stuff, and so I started doing some analysis. I was like, so these guys are coming up with the Nephilim and the giants and all this. Well, I started noticing that a lot of the stuff that these people were putting out there was fabricated. Um, for example, the Nephilim inside the Bible in Genesis that's mentioned, you don't see Nephilim in the King James Bible. You see it in all these some of the parallel versions of it. But then you find that a lot of people out there say that you can't even look at anything except for the King James Bible. There's actually people out there that say that. But when
Yeah.
you take a look at the Strong's Concordance, which is actually the definition of some of these words that you find inside the Bible, when it comes to Nephilim or giants used in that particular verse, when it talks about the sons of God and all that. It's actually defined as a tyrant or a bully. It has nothing to do with an alien or some kind of a physical giant or anything like that. It would be more equated to something like today we would think of somebody like Microsoft or one of these large corporations that are bullies or tyrants. Okay.
Hmm.
So, anyways, so I noticed that the text was a real issue, and when we take a look in the Bible, what we notice is that, or any religious text, we notice that they're always describing things that are very visual, and so because they're always having visions, they're always describing what they see. So I thought what I would do is start taking a look at some of the art that we see, some of the wonderful art that we see from people like Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and I started looking at it, and I started looking at the hieroglyphs the ancient Egyptians left us, and all this art throughout the centuries, the Assyrian reliefs, the stuff that we see in the Sumerian reliefs, all these different things, and I found some very interesting things that should not exist, but they do. And it started with a church called Karlskirche in Vienna, Austria. And I noticed that the high altar in there, after some examination, was actually depicting the Orion Nebula in infrared, which is very interesting because the high altar was actually built in 1737. So immediately I'm thinking, well, there's no way that this could be true because we didn't have infrared capability. Now, this is back when I was not thinking esoterically. I was thinking more, you know, practical, like a practical scientist would think. This can't be
Exactly.
possible.
And
Uh,
by infrared, you're meaning obviously the nebula, the way that you'd only be able to see what the imagery of it is in with an infrared
right, and it
system.
looks completely different than it does when you look at it in the visible spectrum. But when you look at it in the infrared spectrum, it's very, very clear. It's easy face recognition or easy image recognition. Well, so I noticed that that's what was shown there, and this area where they show the triangle in the center of this high altar, they have the divine name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, or Yahweh, and that's in the very center of this thing. Well, that started the whole thing. So basically, the next thing I had to do as an analyst was start looking for repeatability. And I found it in many, many places. I found it in St. Mary's Church in France, and that was built in 1500s, same infrared picture. I found it in Assamkirch in a painting and that's Assamkirch, I believe I think that's in Germany. I also found it in the St. Peter's Basilica,
Basilica. Yeah.
the main altar there. Also the same infrared depiction. Um, Also found it in the Chapel of Versailles in France. And then the two most impressive ones I think that I found were the one in the Mother Jesuit Church, which is called Triumph of the Name of Jesus. And it's actually a picture of the whole Orion constellation with the Orion loop that circles around and the Orion Nebula in the middle. Um, this one in particular was an overlay that I could actually overlay and find all of the pieces were matched right on top of each other. Now,
Hmm.
all these repeated instances of this type of thing, as a scientist, any scientist, when you start finding repeated instances of the same thing, it starts building that there's something going on here. Now, I started finding all these repeated instances of this, and then finally, the link that really gave me the clue about what was going on was when I found Michelangelo's creation of Adam.
Hmm.
Now,
And
Michelangelo's creation of Adam, it's been known for a long time and suspected that what he actually painted when he has God in the cloud was he actually painted a brain.
and the silhouette of that is quite it stands out quite a bit, doesn't it? I think that was probably before I even found your material. That was one that I kind of, in looking at, I think when I was in university, kind of I was like, that looks kind of like a brain in this, but in my kind of subconscious mind. And years later, coming back around to it, it was just like, oh yeah, it is a brain. Maybe that's what originally led me to your work was the creation of Adam brain, because that one is very hard to deny in any way, shape, or
Well,
form.
exactly. Well, I found that what you could do is you could actually zoom in once you've lined this thing up, and of course you don't change the aspect ratio or anything like that.
Yeah,
But
you don't morph or
it's
anything.
right. I don't morph the picture or anything like that. I just make sure that the sizes are the same because you may find one image that's 2,000 by something, and the other image is say four times larger than that. So obviously they have to be the same size in order to be able to overlay them. But what you find though is that when you can zoom in all the way to say, for example, God's head, and you can specifically see the exact same characteristics that you're seeing in Michelangelo's painting, you can see God's arm, you can see Zoa or Eve inside the cloud, which is who Adam has his arm around. Now, here's the interesting thing about this is that neurologists have even written papers that other neurologists who originally had come up with this idea. It was actually some neurologists, I think two of them, came up with the idea that he had painted a brain. The problem is that when you take a look at their diagram, they have the brain flipped in the wrong direction. They
Mm-hmm.
have the brain flipped to where it is facing in left profile when it should be facing in right profile. That's been a weird dispute ever since for a long time. But what you find is that if you take a Gray's Anatomy image of a brain, and you'll find this, by the way, on my Facebook page, I have it all labeled and everything. All the folds that you see inside the brain, the folds that you see on top of uh, the robe on God's hip and everything, this is actually a very common thing that alchemists did a long time ago to hide images in paintings. We also see it in Salvador Dali's work. For
Mm-hmm.
example, there's actually a one painting he does where there's a bunch of people sitting on the ground in front of a mountain, and the mountain is actually with the people and everything together. If you look at it, it's actually a face on its side.
Mm-hmm.
He did that on purpose.
And a lot of your work is basically taking actual real anatomical imagery and overlaying it over something else. So that
Well, and the reason why that is because if we go all the way back into ancient times, all the temples that we see, like Solomon's temple, for example, was designed after the human body. R.A. Schwaller de Lubeck showed us that the Temple of Luxor
Luxor, yeah.
was designed after the human body. If anybody's seen Magical Egypt with John Anthony West, he talks about R.A. Schwaller de Lubeck and he shows the Temple of Luxor, and actually he went into each one of the rooms and read the hieroglyphs and found that each one of those rooms are associated to the exact same areas of the body he was talking about. So we see that the temples are associated to the bodies in the ancient world. And the reason why this is because the ancients believed that if you wanted to understand the universe, you take a look at man because man is a microcosm of the universe. So when we take a look at the universe as a macrocosm, we see it as man. But when we begin to take a look at the writings inside Hermes Trismegistus and Hermetics and things like that, we see that what we're talking about is mind, and this is also brings us into Plato and stuff like this.
Mm-hmm.
If you've ever zoomed out and taken a look at a model of the universe, what the model of the universe looks at that they have out there a picture of when they zoom as far as they possibly can out and look at the whole universe, it looks just like the inside. It looks like a
Nerve
collection of
connections, yeah. Yeah.
neurons inside a brain, almost exactly like it. So, and we hear this constant talk by Plato and by Hermes Trismegistus and by the ancient Egyptians that called it universal mind, that mind seems to be what we're talking about here. And even in the Kabbalion and Hermetics, we have that famous axiom, all is mind, the universe is mental.
Mm-hmm. And the principle of correspondence. What is kind of your best description that you can give to folks of Hermes Trismegistus, and Hermeticism?
Well, Hermes Trismegistus Hermeticism, he was, I would say, he goes back to being Thoth.
Mm-hmm.
And he has many different names. When you start taking a look at the different texts, Hermes Trismegistus, you see his same sayings, for instance, in the Gospel of Thomas, which was supposed to be the sayings of Jesus, but you hear the same sayings that you would probably hear from Hermes Trismegistus inside there. He's really talking about this whole principle that the ancient Egyptians were teaching, where Plato received his mysteries from in Sais. He talks about the universal mind,
Mm-hmm.
and Hermes Trismegistus has these different axiom: as above, so below. The principle of vibration, that everything moves, everything vibrates, and he's the one that came up with these various axioms. The interesting thing about it is that for instance, we could take the principle of vibration, that everything moves, everything vibrates. We know that science came out with string theory in the 1960s and 1970s, and that's exactly what they said, that these strings at a very, very small level, everything moves and everything vibrates. So what science has basically been doing is confirming all the things that we actually see inside Hermetic philosophy.
Right.
They
Yeah.
just don't give them credit for it.
It's funny. I just tried reading for the first time the Corpus Hermeticum like a month ago, and of course I understood about some very small percentage of it, probably in the teens. But it's one of those books that, of course, you'll go back when you become more conscious, and you'll read it again another pass later in life, and you'll get more out of it, and you'll keep doing that cycle and probably seeing more and more into the text because, like with a lot of these ancient texts, there is a lot of encoded information, isn't there?
It's
And
like a jigsaw puzzle.
it
Exactly.
is. It totally is. And it makes total sense that with the imagery, especially all this kind of esoteric imagery, that an artist, if they really knew some esoteric knowledge, because I've certainly learned that the esoteric is where it's at, man. I mean, if you really want to kind of find some things, the esoteric is where to look. But if you were an artist that was commissioned to paint something inside one of these cathedrals, whoever was running the church or the cathedral, it's like it makes total sense that you would encode as much as possible in your work because you knew it could be there for hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Right. Well, the interesting thing about Michelangelo is what he was commissioned to paint inside the Sistine Chapel is not what he painted.
Mm. Hmm.
He painted something completely different than what he was supposed to,
And he's like, "Here you go, fellas."
basically.
Yeah.
And so the interesting thing, I don't know, there's a, book out by Rabbi Benjamin Black called "The Secrets of the Sistine Chapel." He goes into some information about Michelangelo. Well, it turns out Michelangelo was more than likely a Kabbalist.
Mm.
And what he was actually painting when he painted God in the Cloud was he was painting the same thing that we hear about from Plato and from Hermes Trismegistus. It's called the divine mind. And the divine mind is also what we hear about in the Bible, which is called the Christ. Now, a lot of people don't realize that the Christ in the Bible, when you see it in was it Colossians 1:15, it says Christ is the visible image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. Well, when you think of the firstborn over all creation and the visible image, what we're really talking about, the visible of the invisible, we're almost talking about the same thing that we see in Gnosis, except for the fact that Gnosis, when they talk about casting, that Sophia cast her shadow
Hmm.
into the visible universe and created this visible demiurge. Well, that's what the Orion Nebula actually turns out to be. It's the first cognizable image out of the infinite that's created. So these clouds come together, and then we have this spark of lightning, and Blavatsky even goes into this as well.
Yeah, and
But we
you're
have this
referring
is the
to Helen
beginning
of
of
Helen.
creation. Well, it turns
Right.
out that the image that we see there is the image of a human brain, and this is exactly what Michelangelo painted. And he actually painted the Orion Nebula uh, to such a high detail that one has to ask, how did he know how to do this? Because this was 100 years before the first telescope.
Hmm.
People have said before that, well, maybe they could see it better back then. Well, it doesn't matter how good you can see it. Even 500 years ago, it still looks like a fuzzy star in the sky. And in fact, it was not until 1611 that they discovered it because it wasn't apparently lit up.
Right. Well, yeah, there's no
Um,
way. I mean, it's just so obvious. I mean, do you interpret that? I mean, as you're kind of out of the many things that could be, is that if what's happening down here is similar to what we're seeing there? I mean, obviously the Orion Nebula has been there for however many eons,
well,
but has its shape adjusted based on like, that
sure,
time period? I mean, is that,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's okay. So the way it's described is it is a collection, and this is really gets into the esoteric, and it's hard to understand. But okay, have you ever seen the Kabbalah tree of life?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so if you look at the Kabbalah tree of life, at the very top, you have something called Kether.
Hmm.
Okay, and then what you normally see surrounding Kether, or you see these it looks like a glow around Kether. Well, you have in the same Hermetic philosophy, you have these three levels of spirit, and then you move into what's called mind, and then you move into what's called the physical universe. So as spirit moves into its first cognizable image, the first cognizable image that we see is Kether. Now, Kether, it would be related to the pineal gland. Okay, because
Hmm.
when we take a look at the Kabbalah tree of life, what we're really looking at is we're looking at something that you place man on top of. This is one of the reasons why I place the human body on top of the tree of life. So when we take a look at it, we find that Kether is actually located inside the head. And this is actually the mystery place, but it's actually the Orion Nebula and the trapezium. And even some of the Gnostics, which you'll find when you read these texts, you'll find that they're actually speaking of the Orion Nebula, but it refers to the pineal gland. That trapezium area of the Orion Nebula, that is the first part where man comes into existence. The next part that it creates is the brain, which is the waters that surround it. And then we have all of the planets being created by a lightning flash that moves down from Kether all the way down the tree of life down to Malkuth, which is Earth. So what actually occurred is after the nebula was created, it created the planets and the stars and stuff like that through lightning flashes. And this is the exact same philosophy that we see in Blavatsky and exactly what we see in the Thunderbolts project.
And that Helena Blavatsky was, just to kind of let people know. I mean, she was a woman that lived quite a while ago. I mean, over 100 years ago, I think, was it now? And
Well,
she
she
was
wrote The Secret Doctrine in the 1880s.
she did, right, and she was a mystic, I know. And so, the best definition that I have for mystics at my level of knowledge now is that they were mysticism is basically like a series of spiritual practices based around the corpus hermeticum. And I think the mystics were kind of like these uber philosophers, right? And they really knew some things because they'd
She
obviously.
goes, I mean, she goes into Buddhism, she goes into the Upanishad, she goes into, she goes all across the board. And
Hmm.
that's what I like about Blavatsky is she says, well, here's what these guys think, here's what Plato said, here's what Hermes said, so she goes and she compares everything.
Yeah.
And that's important because you can go and check her work and you find out that it's true. Now, and she's been demonized a lot by a lot of people, but what I have found over my time doing research is that those people that are demonized the most by the masses or by the majority are the ones that you need to be paying attention to.
Right. Exactly. It's
In
so.
fact, the public, I use the public, as a matter of fact, to guide me where I should look at what I should look at next. If I hear a bunch of demonization going on about a particular individual or a particular group, then that I put that on the top of my list to research next because I know that there's going to be truth there.
Because everything's backwards and upside down.
Exactly.
It
Everything is
totally is.
upside down.
It's so upside down. It really is. And as you learn more and gain more knowledge, you really kind of start seeing that everything is so out of whack. And one thing that's good, it's neat when you mention certain people that when you come to know the validity of someone and they lead you to other people that you can then sponge off of and learn more from. That's a nice process where, like, when they're talking about somebody else and you've absorbed Blavatsky's information and then she's talking about another person that you really respect.
Or
That's
Manly P. Hall.
Yes. Oh my goodness, Mike. Dude, that guy is unbelievable. I've been diving into Manly P. Hall for probably the last few months, and this podcast is named a little bit after kind of an idea that Terence McKenna had, and I thought McKenna was quite a brain, but oh my gosh, dude, Manly Hall. We should let people know who Manly P. Hall was. He was a mystic, and he was also a 33rd degree Mason, I believe,
That's correct.
and he was a unbelievable well of knowledge. I mean, it's like the amount of information in that guy was just
Well,
daunting.
a lot of people say, yeah, but he's a Freemason. How can you trust him? Well, I want to tell you something. I didn't pick Manly P. Hall because he was a Freemason and because of what he was talking about.
Exactly, and the
I
labels are
picked
like
him
fair enough.
because I made my discoveries first. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's something that I did with that a lot of people don't go out and do. A lot of people want information fed to them. They want drama or something. I went out and did my discoveries first, and I kept finding all of these things related to the Orion Nebula. I finally found this thing with Michelangelo and the brain and the Orion Nebula that he had also painted in his same painting, and that gave me the connection between man and the mind and the nebula. And when I
Hmm.
had that connection and I began to listen to Manly P. Hall and he began to talk about the exact same things and started talking about it from Kabbalah perspective, from mystic Christianity, and all these other areas, and he described it in detail, then I knew that I was onto something and I knew I could trust him as well.
Exactly, and he
I
leads
also
you to good places.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
he never, I've got a lot of friends now that are master masons. A lot of them listen to my work now because they know that I know what I'm talking about and what's going on.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of really good friends that are master mason friends of mine.
Master
What
Masons.
I
That's
what
great.
I've learned is that I started doing a little bit of digging and trying to look for the demonization. What I found was there was a very interesting there's some a very interesting thing called Humanum Genus. If you look on the Vatican site, and it was written, I believe, in the 1800s, and it's basically a long whining session about how they think the Freemasons are trying to ruin the church, and they don't like the Freemasons because the Freemasons are for equality, and they don't like the Freemasons because they didn't necessarily want religion taught in schools. They wanted it to remain, something that people could do on their own. They didn't think that the Freemasons were good for the state. So all the stuff that they're really whining about on the Freemasons are all the things that we would consider criminal anyway, right?
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the fact that they don't believe the Freemasons are good because they're not because they're for equality, and that means the Vatican was not for equality.
Mm-hmm.
And
Well,
if
and
you
then
take a look, they've got another declaration on their site that says concerning Catholic members that want to become Freemasons, if you become a Freemason, they will excommunicate you from the Vatican.
right, which means you
So,
should take a look at Freemasonry.
exact. So all of this demonization really comes from the church and the Catholic Church, but it's spread all over the place because their Jesuits are really good. They're really good at the intel stuff, and they know how to infiltrate these different areas and spread rumors and all this kind of stuff. So they spread all the drama.
Well, and they know that people that have had training in masonry or in mysticism know a thing or two, and they probably have know a little bit more about what's going on than other folks because again in these esoteric areas. And my understanding is that those two different areas share levels of kind of esoteric knowledge. They don't, go over the exact same things, but there's areas that blend between them. And I'm sure that knowledge is very threatening to a power structure such as,
Well,
somebody.
it's extremely threatening. It's always been about if you listen to what the church has to say in all of their documentation, it's always about how they are worried about the church. It's always
Right.
about the church. And if even the Pope came out too long ago in one of his news articles, Pope Francis, and he made in a speech, he says that there's no. He said if your first name is Christian, your last name should be member of the church.
Mm-hmm. Have
That's
you
their ideology. Is that, and they came out with something a long time ago. They said there can be no salvation without the church. So it's all about the church to them. They don't really. And another problem with all of this is that uh, the Freemasons, they do know what's going on, and because they do know what's going on, it's threatening to the whole uh, core structure of
yeah.
what church has been teaching.
Well, and especially systems that want to have you be like worker bee bitch and then consumer when you're really a measure of the universe. And there's so much more to what you're capable of doing. And when, yes, somebody that has had the kind of inner work done in these esoteric practices and know a thing or two,
Well, here's
there you go.
here's the deal too. There's another myth about the fact that Freemasons are a secretive organization. Well, here's the deal. I challenge anyone to name an organization that does not have secrets.
Oh, yes, right, of course, of
Every
course, and
organization out there has secrets.
nobody's
and
perfect
and the
by any
Catholic
means.
Church, they have their secrets. The Freemasons have their secrets, and just about every organization you will find, every corporation you will find, everything imaginable that you can think of that has a group of people in it, they're going to have secrets in it. And the Freemasons, they don't keep if you want to find out what's going on, there's an archive, Manly P. Hall's archive.
Hmm.
It's manlyphall.us, and you will find everything that you want to know from A to Z, for across culture, everything. And he discloses all kinds of information. Now, there's some secrets that they do keep very high up, and they keep that because not everybody is ready to hear it before you. I mean, what they want you to do is they want you, and you can tell by the way Manly P. Hall puts out his information, is he wants you to find out this. He wants you to take the first step and start digging and to be curious yourself because they
Yeah.
don't want to hand all this information to people who are not interested.
Yeah, and there's some information I'm sure I don't presume to be the expert on it myself, but there's some information that you really need to be properly initiated into or to be
Right. It's like,
there's
otherwise you're
steps along the
casting
way
pearls
that
before the swine, right?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, Manly P Hall. I mean, at very least, if anybody is spending their time just listening to Manly P Hall lectures, I mean, I love his 2 hour just monologues. I don't know if he wrote those out ahead of time, if you know, but if that was all just from the top of his head, but it's
Well,
just so
I've listened to him when you can actually see a couple of videos where he's talking and you can actually see him talk, and he's just talking to people.
really, wow, that is fascinating because he seems so articulate, and
I know.
every moment is just so packed with rich information. And when somebody is going off the top of their head like that, I should say, and it is worth listening to many times over, that is just so fascinating. And it just shows. I mean, I wonder how that guy got the just deep well of knowledge that he did. Obviously, he did a
being
lot of
curious
work, and
being curious. Here's the deal with all of this stuff. These guys that are on the extreme scientific side, that are into the whole mainstream science. um, Science is great. Okay, and then religion, on the guys that are on the extreme religion side, that religion, there's nothing wrong with that because we're
Hmm.
dealing with a complete other side of the coin. The issue is that nobody ever comes together. You don't. The science guys refuse to give these guys that are religious guys any credit whatsoever, regardless of the fact that the whole Big Bang theory came from a Jesuit priest who got his information from the ancient Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the Jesuit priest is what gave them the whole idea of the cosmic egg, the Big Bang theory. And I can't remember the name, his name off the top of my head, but his whole idea of the cosmic egg comes from, ancient Egypt and things like this.
Hmm.
And so, but yet they refuse to acknowledge them. The religious guys, on the hand, they refused. I think that they're getting a little bit better because they kind of have to now, but they're starting to acknowledge the scientific side. So, but the esoteric falls right in the middle. See,
Hmm.
because it leverages from both sides. It's almost like right brain and left brain thinking, if you want to kind of think about it. The left brain is the scientific, the
Yeah.
right brain is the intuitive, spiritual, religious side. But the
And
real information lies right in the middle where you leverage from both.
that takes a level of knowledge and a level of understanding and a level of research. And to get to even that deep below the surface, most people spend their entire lives without even being willing to go that deep to really be able to then look at some of these things and some of these ancient texts, for example, with new eyes and see the allegory in them and the encoded symbolism in them, and then subsequently get so much more out of them and realize that there is some really good material in some of these things.
That's right. That's what they haven't done yet. Science, the mainstream science still sees the whole universe as this materialistic, mechanical, everything is dead, kind of thing. And then you have the religious guys that are very dogmatic in their views.
Yeah, like
What we
shove
really
the
need is we really need more people that will go out there and research all of the various ancient texts, take all the data, throw it out on the table, see where the things are that are similar, see what they're talking about that way, because you can learn a lot about the Bible just by looking at other ancient texts, because you can find the similarities all across the board and say, so that's what they're talking about
hmm
when they mention that in the Bible. They're not talking about what everybody thinks they're talking about. They're talking about the same thing that they're mentioning over here in the pyramid text, the same thing they're mentioning over here in the vision of Hermes, and et cetera, that we see in Gnosis or what have you. If there would be more people that would go out there and do that kind of thing, we'd get to the truth a lot quicker. But science doesn't want to recognize anything there.
do
And
you,
the religious people do not want you to look at anything outside of what their teaching is. And until we get past all that, we're going to have issues.
Do you think that a separating of kind of spirituality and maybe not a belief in God in the traditional sense that organized religion hands down, but a belief in some sort of thing that is almost incomprehensible in terms of
Well,
creation
I kind of think of it as a
is
reality, right? Instead of necessarily calling it God, because when people think of God, they think of something that they have to worship. They think of this personal anthropomorphic God. When
right.
when we're not really dealing with something like that necessarily, but we're dealing with kind of an unfolding of reality in kind of in a way that people aren't accustomed to thinking about.
Right. And it seems like separating that stuff from organized religion and church going is kind of a, I guess that was something that it was helpful to me to then kind of allow you to then get in that area where you start looking at esoteric things and start going down rabbit holes and then, oh,
Exactly.
yeah,
But it's very frightening for some people to do.
well, and
A
you
lot
have
of
to,
people are taught this kind of stuff their whole life, and they're so conditioned to think if you go and look at anything else, you're going to go to hell. They have these people hanging hell over their head all the time, and
guilt.
they're so conditioned and they're so afraid, and they become very defensive about stuff like this that it's really kind of hard to break that. With these kind of people, and it's a shame. I do the best I can as far as the information I provide. And one of the things that people will always notice about my work is I don't just throw something out there. I always back it. I always back it with as many different areas as I can possibly find, showing that what I'm saying is making sense from many different angles.
How much like research do you do, man, between each thing that you show? I must think that you must go down a lot of pathways with that before you kind of make connections between things. I'm sure that the more you do it, the better you get at it. But there's probably a lot of work that goes in behind the scenes of what you do.
Well, it really depends on what I'm kind of thinking about at the moment. Like I may have a particular thought about an aspect of what it is that I'm researching. So I take that particular aspect and I see if there is anything about it in, say, Kabbalah, and then I see if there's anything about it in, say, Gnosis, and I see if there's anything about it in what we find from the teachings of Hermetic philosophy or from and so I'll just go across and I'll start looking for if there's a similar concept that we see, and I'll look for it in the Bible. I look for it in many different places, and I've kind of got my different places already kind of figured out. I go across the board. Buddhism. One of the things I like about Blavatsky is that's exactly the kind of thing that she does. And so
Hmm.
I try to do the same things. And what that really is theosophy. And theosophy does that kind of thing. Religious folks that are very dogmatic, they demonize theosophy. But because theosophy does all this, they call them Satan worshipers and all this kind of stuff. It's just crazy stuff. But what they're really doing is they're doing the exact same thing I do. They look for the similar things in all these various areas. So, and over time, it just builds.
Yeah.
You find a connection. For example, I found the connection to Michelangelo, the brain, and the Orion Nebula, and I needed to know why those three somehow connected. And I found out that it had to do with man. I found out that there's a lot about it in Kabbalah, the tree of life. I found out that there was a lot about it regarding Plato, what we hear about from the works of Philo, what we hear about in the Bible regarding the seventh angel, the cloud, what the vision of Ezekiel, what we see in Revelation. And so it just builds and builds, and you start seeing like particular keywords like luminous cloud, which is mentioned in Christianity, which is mentioned in Gnosis,
Hmm.
and you begin to see that there are these same things that are talked about all across the board, and it all starts falling together.
Yeah, and you see how religions have so many similarities and are so intertwined with each other and go back to very similar things, back to ancient Egypt and astrology and sun worship and all this knowledge that we used to know and that we've kind of lost but are regaining as we kind of come back around again. And it's neat when you can kind of use the tools of the trade to kind of crack the code of some of that stuff and then use it to kind of learn more. But like in terms of man being, it seems like in your work you've kind of really come to see that man is a very important aspect to the cosmos. So one thing that I'm kind of always curious about with that is that if man is, if we're just one part of the kind of overarching species here on the planet, like obviously there's a lot of other things that we share this planet with. I mean, that means that we are, obviously we know that we're the dominant species on the planet, but does this mean that if we're so key to the if the as above so below, and that man is kind of if what's going on with us is actually what's going on above, I wonder how that relates to some of the other organisms. If you're looking at human anatomy, I mean, how does this relate to like the anatomy of an animal or anything? I wonder if there's any correlations, or if that's, if they were the original, like let's say the all the species were originally here on the planet and we've come from elsewhere or something and have been.
Well, we did. We came from our origin or our root is the Orion Nebula. But here's the deal: we can't really think of it in terms of material reality in the way we think of
Mm-hmm.
that science presents as far as standard evolution and all this kind of stuff and random chance and we have the esoteric side, right? The first when we hear about the first man called Adam that was created, the Kabbalists and the Jewish scholars understand that that first man was created was not a terrestrial man. It was a what they call the heavenly man.
Is that the Adam Cadman, right?
That's the Adam
Yeah,
Kadmon.
yeah.
Now, that Adam Kadmon was the archetype of man. And when they used the word man, that included women back then. Okay,
Right, it's
but
both sexes.
but it was also androgynous. And we know from Plato that the first thing that was born out of the infinite is called mind or the demiurge. So, what is an archetype of man that would cover both man and woman, that would be androgynous and also represent mind? It would be a brain. And that's exactly what we see in the Orion Nebula. And this is what we see in Kabbalah. Now, here's the interesting thing Blavatsky tells us that the sun, our sun in our solar system, is the heart of our solar world system. And hidden behind our visible sun is the brain. And she actually mentions that inside the secret doctrine, and that brain is actually the Adam Kadmon, which represents the Merkava, or the divine, or the chariot of righteousness, and that is actually the Orion Nebula. And the Orion Nebula is, and we take a look at Thunderbolt's project,
Hmm.
we see that these Birkeland currents actually power our sun, and this is exactly what the ancients believed as well. They believed that the source of light does not actually come from our sun in the solar system, but our sun acts as a lens which takes the light from where the brain comes from and actually projects it down to Earth. So we see that our solar system and our cosmos and space itself is actually resembling man, and we can see this because we can actually see the archetypes in the cosmos. But this is exactly what the ancients believed a long time ago, all the way back to ancient Egypt.
And
And
the
the
Mayans.
pyramids that they were pointing us to, um, the pyramids that we see in Egypt, and what they were actually pointing us to is they were pointing us to the Orion Nebula, not just Orion's belt, but they were pointing us to the Orion Nebula because it was a symbol of universal mind. And if you've listened to Initiation of the Pyramid by Manly P. Hall, then
Mm.
you know this. The Alexandrian mystics believed that it was called the Tomb of Hermes. Well, but it wasn't the tomb of a dead pharaoh. It was the symbol of universal mind. Well, when we take a look at Hermes and some of the things he said, we see that he says Egypt is the image of heaven. It is the projection below of the order of things above. Well, when we take a look at Egypt and we take a look at the Orion Nebula, we see that what they were really pointing us to was the trapezium of the Orion Nebula because it is a mirror image of what we see the Nile Delta as.
So this is kind of maybe the same question I just asked, but if you're like when you're doing an overlay of like human anatomy on the Nile Delta,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what does that say about, let's say that the Nile is a very specific waterway on Earth? I mean, what does that say about other waterways on the planet too? I mean, if there's anatomical correlations between like certain areas of the spine and the Nile.
Well, there's a significance about the Nile and the Nile Delta. The significance about it is number one, that's where the Great Pyramids are placed, is right there where the Nile Delta is. There's something very significant about why they placed that there. But if we also take a look at the Nile Delta, it's the very center of all of Earth's land masses.
Mm,
And a long time ago, the
mm,
ancients saw it as the prime meridian. It was the 0 point.
So it's kind of like, yeah, like the starting point of where to radiate out from.
It's
So
exactly. It's the
yeah.
very center, right? And so they were. That's something that's very significant that we don't see anywhere else on the planet. It's the very center of all of Earth's land masses. So what were they trying to show us with the Nile and the Nile Delta? Well, when we read the pyramid texts and we take a look at what they were talking about, they would say things like, "I can sail down the Nile as a living soul, or sail up the Nile to." As a phoenix. And they're kind of talking about the whole process of rebirth. Here's another interesting thing. The pyramids, as Manly P. Hall mentions, are are a word that has kind of been brought over from ancient Egypt, because we find that the pyramids of the brain are actually located right where the spinal column connects to the skull, and that's exactly where they are placed when we take a look at the Nile and the Nile Delta. The pyramids are located right where the spinal cord connects to the skull, and that's where it's also the doorway. If we take a look at the Kabbalah tree of life, the doorway, that's where we have the spinal column connecting to the skull as well. So we see these common things, but that's where the pyramids of the brain are located, and that's where the pyramids are located in ancient Egypt.
Hmm.
They're located in the exact same place where you'd have the spinal column connecting to the skull.
I wonder if some of the other pyramids that are around the planet have other correlations with them. I mean, I know that a lot of the ancient sites are on ley lines and the grid lines and things, and
Oh, I'm sure they
I'm
do.
I'm sure that as your research continues and you kind of look at more geography of the planet, you'll find more interesting correlations to things. And it's really fascinating how also if you use man as just kind of a measuring tool, which you seem to do a lot of in your work, how it just allows you to really kind of find things and like
Man is the measure of all things, right? I
I
mean,
know. Even I wonder if even that correlates with like the people of Walmart. It's like
well, here's the deal. When it actually says in the Bible, it says man is made in God's image. So if you want to know about the universe and about God's creation, you take a look at man because man was made in God's image. And this is what the ancients believed a long time ago.
And that technically could be any person, couldn't it? It could be somebody that's morbidly obese or somebody that looks like Michelangelo's David. I mean, it just depends on, obviously everybody's different and everybody's got their
Well,
unique physicalities, but
The ancient Egyptians, what they used, and they pretty much used the internal parts and the parts that you can use with sacred geometry. They kind of went by a certain standard.
hmm
When you take a look at enough people, you kind of average everything out. Like, for example, I can take a look at a lot of brains with MRIs on the internet and a lot of spinal columns, but you learn that there are certain ones that are the more healthy ones that have that all of the stuff is intact and it's straight and it's erect, or the brain is all there and we don't have pieces missing and stuff like that. Well, you find that it's easy to start locating the geometry and stuff when you've looked at enough of them.
yeah, and you're
It
using a
has nothing to
healthy,
do with the fact that one is better than the other or anything like that. It's just that the geometry that we find from the flower of life and stuff like that, which is really, when you start laying the flower of life on top of the human body, you can really see that the human body is actually designed after that pattern.
And could you give everybody just a quick once over as to what the flower of life is? I remember I read Melchizedek's book, The Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life, but maybe you could just do a little recap so people know what that is. It's sacred geometric patterns.
Yeah, well, it's all based off of circles, okay? And so you can put it's basically a pattern created by totally by circles. And you if you just type in flower of life on in your image search, you'll pick one up. It's kind of hard to describe
Yeah,
uh,
you really have to see it.
without you kind of have to see an image of it.
Yeah,
But
but it's a
basically, the image, the flower of life image that's actually created, you can take it one step beyond and you can make it a little bit more complex. And what you'll notice is all the patterns that you see inside there. If you lay it on top of certain areas of the human body, like the skull, for example, you start seeing how the curvatures of the skull, the eye sockets, the nose, the mouth, and all these kinds of things, they fall right in line with what you see the curvatures as far as the geometry goes. There's no straight lines in sacred geometry like this. The other important thing that we see in sacred geometry is the Fibonacci spiral or the golden
mhm.
spiral, which you see in plants all over the place.
Yeah, you can
You
notice that when you're a little kid, man. If you look at just any sort of organic matter, it's so everywhere. And of
Right.
course, scale is irrelevant.
Take a look at the any galaxy, any spiral galaxy. Those spirals that come out, those usually are in the pattern of a golden spiral. Or if you take a look at a pine cone, the way the pine cone moves up to the top, kind of like you see the stripes on a candy cane. It's also in a Fibonacci spiral, and this kind of thing you see all over the place. And this also applies to the human body as well. I found out, and and I've shown this. In many different diagrams. And the way that they measured things was they measured things from the crown of the head, just above the pineal gland, all the way down to the bottom of the sacrum or their very tip of the coccyx. And it just so happens that when the golden spiral is placed in this fashion, that the first pass of the spiral uh, separates the head from the body, and the second pass of the spiral passes right along the edge of the sacrum. You learn these type of things when you start messing with the geometry, and this is the type of thing that if they go out there and start making these discoveries for themselves, they'll start seeing how all these things fit together and why man is so important in this whole picture. It's
hmm
not because that we're arrogant to be assuming this. You just start seeing how man plays an important part in the microcosm versus the macrocosm.
Yeah, it's like you say in terms of arrogance. It's not like mankind is the only one, and we're here to kind of trash the planet, and this is our divine place to be. It's kind of like
Right.
I guess I shouldn't look at the as above so below thing in such a corporeal sense, right? It's not like when you zoom out to the furthest parts of the universe, it's not like the universe is a human body and the Orion Nebula is the brain. It doesn't quite work like that, right? But there's
Well,
these correlations.
if you zoom all the way out, you see that the whole universe looks just like the internal parts of a brain as well. But that doesn't necessarily mean that what you're looking at is a brain. The ancient Egyptians believed that you could look at all of nature. You can find this in Ari Schwaller de Lubic's it's called "Symbol and the Symbolic and the Evolution of Consciousness," I believe is the name of the book.
hmm
Anyway, he shows that the ancient Egyptians cultivated their intellect to looking at all of nature, showing them the phenomena of the universe from the spiritual all the way down to the material. They learned that the universe was writing to them in code and telling them things. So when we look at things physically in the universe and the cosmos and stuff, one of the things that science hasn't learned how to do is to recognize that it's almost like hieroglyphics.
Hmm.
It's almost like when you're looking at, for example, I look at the nebula, I can actually see that there are things in there showing us something besides just a bunch of gas.
Hmm.
It's actually showing us something that's important. It's almost like imagistic hieroglyphs, and this is when we get into the metaphysical. But this is, I believe, one of the reasons why the ancient Egyptians spoke to us in hieroglyphs, because they communicate so many different things that words can't do. See, words only work to a certain level. Um, and they always have to fall to the level of the allegory. But when you present an image to somebody, it's completely different because then you're communicating to somebody on so many different levels, different abstract area, ways of thinking. The way that the things are positioned in the image can communicate so many different things that words cannot describe. So, for example, I can show you a picture of a cloud in the sky, and that cloud may be very complex. And if I show you three other clouds and one of them matches it, you'll be able to pick it out immediately and tell me which one matches that one in the sky. But now, if I ask you to describe in words what it looks like, you wouldn't be able to do it.
Hmm. Yeah, and
You'd say it looks like a cloud. Well, I'll say, well, tell me what makes that cloud different than the other. You won't be able to do it
and the
because words cannot suffice when you get to a certain level. Words just are not they're not sufficient, and you can only fall to the level of the allegory. You can say, well, that cloud looks like an eye or something like that, or it looks like a something else that I'm familiar with. And this is exactly the way the ancients thought when they began to talk about things in allegory. They would communicate things that way.
And a picture is certainly worth 1,000 words, and there's a reason they say that. And especially with symbolism, like Manly P. Hall says, if you're looking at symbolism, it really forces you to do it. It's intriguing when you see an image that you don't know what it's saying, but you know that there's more to it, and you know that there's more beneath the surface, and motivates people to dive into these things more. So that's why so much symbolism is just so interesting to look at, even if it's
Symbolism is so important because
oh, it is
you can learn so much about, one of the biggest misconceptions is this whole eye in the triangle thing that people have been spreading about, and this whole
providence.
Illuminati thing. And just I want to take a second just to let everybody know the whole fear mongering that is going on right now with the whole archons and I've already proven that Plato and Plotinus, who wrote about the demiurge 600 years before the Gnostics even started writing about the same area, they understood that this area was benevolent, and it had nothing to do with something being evil. The Gnostics believed that anything in the material universe has to do with something evil, and that's what this whole thing about the archons has started, and everybody is spreading all this stuff about Saturn and all this other kind of stuff. It's all fear mongering, and they don't know what they're talking about. And I've shown all of this.
Well, it should always be anybody that's providing information where it's encouraging you to do the real work and empowering you is worth looking at, and people that are trying to exclude things that is oftentimes something to be wary of. But like, with the eye of providence, I mean, with that on the dollar bill, what do you make of that? I mean, is that just the founding fathers, many of whom were Masons, just
No,
knowing?
this doesn't have anything to do with just the Masons didn't come up with that originally.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
goes all the way back into ancient Egypt.
I'm just curious how I haven't done the research myself as to why we
Well,
have.
okay, so if we take a look at if we take a look at ancient Egypt, and we take a look at the pyramids, we see the geometry of the pyramid, and we know that the pyramid has to do with universal mind. And when we take the human body and we put the head on top of it, we can actually see that it's built in such a way that the geometry of the skull is meant to fit inside the pyramid. So now, when we take a look inside the old cathedrals and stuff, you typically will see the image of what they call God the Father. Have you ever seen this before? You see the image of God, and they always have triangles on top of their heads.
Hmm.
Well, it's the same kind of message that you're seeing with the pyramids. Now, I found something in Saint Joseph Cathedral where they even have the air shafts, and they match up exactly to the air shafts that you see in the Giza pyramid as well.
Right, and those are the stained lines in the stained glass.
That's
Right.
right.
Yes.
They match up exactly the same as what you see.
And those are the lines that they know now are pointing to specific constellations. They're not just air
Well, I
shafts.
don't know that I'm not sold on that yet.
Oh, okay.
I
I
think
thought
it's
that
a
was
theory.
confirmed.
I'm not sold on it yet. I think it's a theory,
Okay.
but I'm not so sure about that yet.
Yeah, I'm certainly not the expert on it. That was just
Well,
my
I mean, I'm not either, but
yeah.
I'm not sold on it yet because there's some other things about all that that I don't think they have discovered. You know, they think that, for example, the missing capstone. They think that it used to be gold, and that they talk about the Giza pyramid being a power plant and all that. Well, I don't think that was the main purpose of the pyramid, and neither does Graham Hancock.
Mm.
When you take a look at the pyramid and you take a look at all the math and all the geometry inside of it, it was meant to be something that was informational. They were trying to show us that they knew a lot of different things. They knew about the size of the Earth, they knew about the solar system, they knew about the speed of light, they knew about all these different things. And there's no reason to put all that geometry and all the perfection into such a building like that if the only purpose of it was to be a power plant.
Well, and it's so thought provoking, though, the just various theories that what the pyramids could have been. And just it's interesting in your work too how when you overlay the pyramids, even kind of the subterranean structure of the chamber underground and how that lines up with the spine and things like that, it's just they become more and more fascinating every time you kind of find out new things about them.
Right. So if we take a look in Kabbalah, for example, if you've ever taken a look at the divine name, a lot of times in Kabbalah you will see them stack the divine name, which is four characters. You have the Yod He Vod He, right? And the top one, which is the Yod, uh, they stack that on the very top, and that is the head. And what you actually see is that the name actually creates a body, and the old Hebrew letters were meant to be used as symbols as well. You always see that yod inside a triangle. That triangle also refers to, so the eye inside of the triangle, when we take a look at E.A. Wallace Budge, so we always see the head or the eye is located inside the triangle. You see it in the God the Father symbolism. You see it in the alchemical art. You see it in Kabbalah, where Yod, which is the head of the divine name, is located inside the triangle. Um, and then we even see that E.A. Wallace Budge, who did most of the deciphering of the pyramid, of the ancient hieroglyphs and stuff, he talks about that being the Eye of Osiris. The Eye of Osiris, which is his symbol, was an eye that was inside of a tent, which is an eye in a throne or an eye resting inside of a tent, and that meant good man or being. And he
Mm.
finds the same thing is also mentioned as Asari, and also in Ashur and all these other ancient texts. So we see that it has something to do with something good. Well, Blavatsky also mentions that the capstone of the pyramid, the whole pyramid, is the structure of the cosmos as it moves down. And the reason the capstone is missing is because it is where the material universe disappears into the infinite.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, and the pyramid correlation with Orion's belt is certainly just undeniable, isn't it, too? That's just such a definitely more than meets the eye with these things for sure.
Yeah, Robert Vival was good to catch that, but we can also find that it's also mentioned in the pyramid text as well, because it says that the construction of the pyramid is Osiris, and Osiris we know is related to Orion. So if you put those two together, Osiris has come as Orion, and we know that the construction of the pyramid is Osiris. It doesn't take a rocket science to figure out that the pyramids are associated to Orion. It's kind of like if A plus B is if or is A if A plus B is equal to C and B plus C is equal to A, you know, it's the same kind of thing. It's by association.
Yeah, and one thing leads you to another and another to another. Have you gone down certain paths where you've kind of investigated something and then realized it didn't really have much of a correlation and then kind of moved
Yeah.
on? Yeah, I'm
Oh,
sure
yeah.
that
I mean, I
there's,
can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I've gone down a lot of dead ends before.
yeah,
Where I thought maybe something meant something, but it didn't. And if it didn't, then I moved on. I've also gone down looking for a particular thing, but found out that I uncovered something completely different, but something very important during that search. So,
yeah. It seems like that's kind of inevitable with any sort of research process that there's huge brushstrokes that kind of, again, as you go down the certain alleyways, you kind of learn when to to look in certain directions. But as an analyst, is that something that in your past you've done a lot of with in former
Yeah, I mean,
careers? And
I just enjoy solving puzzles, and to me, this is like the ultimate puzzle to solve.
it is. It's really interesting how you've taken your skill set and applied it to something that's such an important thing, and it can really be a great communication tool for sharing. I mean, it's great that you're doing it, man. That you're putting it out there and just kind of again saying like, "Hey, here's my research. This is what I'm finding, and this is what I'm sharing, and I'm finding this compelling information." And it's nice to be able to then pass that on and have other people be able to then help kind of raise people's awareness about things.
Well, I think I think people typically enjoy drama. They like drama, and I think that's the reason why you see some of the most popular videos out there have to do with things regarding things that are extremely dramatic, like demons and all kinds of stuff like this. And that applies to the majority. My work does not apply to the majority, although it should. It doesn't. They're not going to be as interested in it, even though I can give them. I consider my work kind of a step above what you see a lot with the majority, because I supply all of the ancient texts, all of the information and the evidence and things like this. I give them links to all kinds of things to show them that when I put something out there, I'm not just making up some elaborate dramatic story. I'm giving them what we can find, and we can find evidence of the same thing all across culture. But this is not necessarily attractive to the average Joe.
Well, when
The average Joe wants to be entertained.
right. It's so funny when you're overlaying, when you make a video, my good man, of like you overlaying something with the tree of life and then overlaying the human anatomy over some Renaissance painting over a galaxy. Uh, I'm not surprised these days when a cat Roomba video has 100,000 times more views than that. I think like YouTube videos are kind of a gauge on how our society is doing. So
Yeah, I agree.
manly P Hall videos, 22 views, twerking videos, 22 million views. So it's kind of,
Exactly. Like
yeah, we have a long
people
way to
want to
go.
be entertained. They want to be scared. They want to be. They like drama, and and they don't want to have to think too much, and that's typically the way the majority is. Now, when you start putting information out there for people that's deep, where they actually have to do a little bit of thinking, where they actually have to be curious, well, and you actually start supplying evidence, and uh, some people's eyes begin to blur over because they're not being entertained. And some people just are just not curious enough to want to get into it.
Or
And
they
so
just
I'm not
dismiss it.
interested in what I have found is I'm really not casting pearls before the swine, because the people who are interested in what I'm putting out there will pay attention, and the people that are part of the majority that want to be part of the drama and all that, they're not going to watch it, and I prefer that they don't watch it anyway.
Yeah, and again, when you put out any sort of thought-provoking, dig deeper work, like you say, it really makes people have to do. When you do your long workday and you come home and you want to sit on the couch and just be a blob and not do any thinking, it's like you're not going to go directly to your material. You're going to go to some blah blah blah, like the
Exactly.
blah, 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 blah.
And I
So
have to say, I piss a lot of people off with my work too. I piss the science. I'm kind of caught between the middle. The scientists don't want to give me any credit, but they can't debunk what I'm putting out there. And then you have the dogmatic religious people. They don't. They get really upset, and I've been called Satan worshiper and all this other kind of stuff
mhm.
about the information I'm putting out, but they can't debunk any of the stuff or anything that I'm putting out either, because I always supply the evidence and all this thing behind everything I do. So I get it from both sides, and I think that's
Yeah.
kind of funny.
Well, and
But
it's so easy to just blanketly state something about anything you don't like. Like anything you don't like is, oh, it's Satan. It's like, oh, I could just randomly say anything I don't like is unicorns. It's just, you have to, like you
right,
say, it's nice when you actually, if you had somebody that was disagreeing with your information in some way and put out kind of a professional, proactive criticism of it in a video form, and you have yet to see hardly anybody do
I
that.
have yet to see one single video of anybody who has done any analysis at all that has decided to try to debate me or whatever. They just won't do it. I get a lot of people that whine in the comment sections and stuff like that, and I've learned that if they start calling me Satan like that, my response to them is typically, well, your mom or something like that.
Sure, sure.
I mean, because it makes about as much sense, right? So
Yeah.
I've just learned to laugh at it, and then I just make jokes about it and stuff like that because I don't really give them any attention.
Well, and yeah, and I wouldn't let any sort of. I'm not an expert on negative criticism or anything, but like, this podcast, for example, is on YouTube, but it's such a tertiary, probably obscure, unknown thing that I have yet to get any sort of negative criticism. But it's like, yeah, you can't really dwell on it or let it get you down, and you just have to kind of move on from it. It's just like move on is a good rule of practice, and keep putting out the material. And as you learn more and you grow more, and you kind of we're all in this kind of process, we're all in this journey. It's like one thing I like that you've done is you've kind of gone back over some of your material and been like, oh hey, look, I've even discovered more, or I've even
Yeah,
opened
you
up
know what?
this.
That's kind of the neatest thing about having the internet like we have now today is because people as well as myself, I've been able to watch myself grow over time and learn much more about. I mean, I can go back now and I can take a look at some of the stuff I did, 3 years ago, and I said, everybody, there's something special about this Orion Nebula, and I don't know what it is, and I'm talking about it, and I'm saying certain things about it, and just listening to the way I'm talking, I can see that I'm, in this first part of this discovery, and I kind of look back at it and I kind of chuckle, because I know that I had no idea what I was about to start discovering as time went on. So it's kind of neat to see this whole developing, as I went on, for about 3 years. It's kind of neat to see or watch yourself grow like that.
Oh, totally, totally, man. I mean, I'm sure I'll look back at episodes of this podcast and be like, just, oh, what was I thinking? But then it helps you show that you're improving, and that you're always bettering yourself, and that it's a learning process.
And it's good to do it with other people involved too, because if you're just doing it one way and you don't have the interaction with other people, I mean, people have said this to me before. They love to go back and take a look at the older stuff, and they can see how I've grown. I've had some of the master masons talk to me about that before
Oh yeah,
as
yeah.
well. That they love to see, kind of the process that I went through as I went through all this, which is kind of almost like an initiation.
Exactly. And that's nice when you know that somebody that maybe does have some profound knowledge, and has done the kind of processes where they've gained a certain level of knowledge, and they are kind of like the kung fu master, and you can get encouraging words like you're on the proper path from them. That really is reassuring and allows you to just kind of keep moving forward.
Right. And
Yeah.
you learn over time the different uh, people that you can. I mean, I don't ever trust completely anybody on what they're telling me, but not necessarily because they think they're telling me a lie, but simply because I want to find out the information for myself. So I always, it doesn't matter if it's Manly Hall or Blavatsky or the Thunderbolts Project or mainstream science or who it is, whatever the information is, I take it in, and I began to start comparing it about among all the different things. And that's just the way that I do things. It has nothing to do, but I just find that over time there's certain people that I can rely on more, like Manly Hall and like Blavatsky and like Alan Watts or Terence McKenna or people
Hmm.
like this. You learn over time who the people are that you can trust more.
Have you looked at the work of George Gurdjieff?
A little. I don't
Yeah,
know enough to
he's
talk about it.
yeah, he's another one that might be worth looking at. I know that he is kind of in a camp with Blavatsky and Steiner and Manly Hall. So I
Hmm.
think that they're four people that in my path so far, I'm pretty sure I can safely say that all of them really knew things,
Hmm.
and he's probably one that is worth looking at. Steiner is one that I know that you've had some Steiner stuff with, and um, Steiner is somebody that is a person that his material at this point, it's like I'm able to get certain downloads from, and maybe not many as I get from Manly Hall at this point. So I'm kind of doing the Manly Hall thing for now, and I'm getting mega downloads from Manly Hall, and then after a while, I'll go back and revisit Steiner when maybe I have attained more understanding from Manly Hall, and then kind of
Well,
do
it
the
seems like
cycle.
everybody has their area of specialty that there's this particular thing that you might be interested in, and usually over time you'll you'll go where the data takes you or where the flow takes you, and so eventually I'll probably go and take a look at some of his work. But what I've just been doing is I've just been going with the flow as to where I find the data and where it pops up, and who talks about it, and I've noticed who the people are that are providing the false information. And there's a lot of fear mongering out there right now about some of this kind of stuff. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that people just don't want people to look at certain things, whether it be symbolism or what have you. And I've tried to put a lot of that out there to try to show people that it's bogus. Because I want people to go out there and explore and take a look at these things. I want people not to be afraid of it. They shouldn't be afraid of it. It's a part of us. It's a part of our past, um, and so that's the reason I try to put this stuff in its place when I see fear mongering and stuff that's going on out there regarding no matter what it is. But I just go where the data takes me, wherever it takes me. If it takes me to Manly Hall, if it takes me to Blavatsky, if it takes me to these various areas, and it just so happens the particular subject matter that I'm studying has taken me to those particular people.
Hmm.
But who knows? It may take me to George in a while.
Yeah, well, it's a lot better way to spend your time through your research process. I love, dude, I love how you put Manly P. Hall audio over your stuff. That's just so like makes me so warm and fuzzy when I see that. But it's nice when you start getting numerous things firing from different angles, where he's saying something and then you're having a synchronicity where then you're discovering something the next day or at the same time, and then something else that you're doing is just kind of correlating so that you can then know that what you're doing is kind of maybe getting somewhere
Well,
and
one of the
making progress.
powerful things I discovered that I could do is I could use Manly P. Hall and what he's lecturing about, along with the visuals that I provide to tell a story, or to tell to show some kind of information about what he's actually referring to.
Yeah. How
And
did
what that does is it gives me more credibility because I'm not the one that's doing the talking. Manly P. Hall is doing the talking,
yeah, and he describes it so well because
and
he's
I'm
so
showing
articulate.
what he's talking about. And so together, I think we make a good team. I wish he were still alive. I could talk for hours with that guy.
Yeah, and he does a great job of explaining things and then proposing solutions to things. Because a lot of people that were brilliant minds, many of whom have now gone on, but have this kind of now distributed consciousness on the internet. They're just kind of talking. But Manly P. Hall seems to be one that not only knew a thing or two, and so much of his stuff. Anytime I hear something of his that, of course, isn't my level of knowledge yet, where it's just kind of like I don't even know what he's talking about. I'll probably go back later and realize that he's saying some pretty amazing things there. He's not just stating something and leaving it hanging. He's like kind of coming back around and then proposing a solution to things, or allowing you to then have breadcrumbs to then get to the next level with what he's saying. So that's really awesome knowledge. And imagine if we lived in a society where everybody was listening to Manly P. Hall every night.
Well, and it's not just not, and it didn't have to be just Manly P. Hall. We just
Yeah,
need
of
a
course.
society where people were more curious about, and people were not so biased to one particular thing, but allowed themselves to explore and be curious about things without being afraid or without feeling like something else is silly or something like that, but actually look at the data for what it is. I think that we've come a lot further than where we are.
Well, yeah, it's been a good chat, man. I appreciate you coming on, and it's been neat kind of take on how you do things. And where can people find you online, man?
Well, sure, you can find me by my name if you go to Facebook. It's Danny Wilton. My last name is spelled Wilten. Or you can find me on YouTube if you type in the same name, Danny Wilton. But what you'll find is that the YouTube name is Starscream, but it's actually written as 5T4R Scream. The easiest way to find me on YouTube is just type in my name, Danny Wilton, Wilten. And if you go on to my channel, you'll find several playlists on there. At the very top, one of them is called the Starter Playlist. So if you're really interested in some of my work and some of the stuff I have to show you, if that starter playlist will give you a really good um, will give you a really good, I would say more than a briefing. It goes into a lot of detail about my work and what I do, and kind of how I go across culture and I show different things, and how the images that I found in these cathedrals, it all comes down to a subject matter that's related to how we seem to be related to the Orion Nebula or in the Orion constellation, and what our tie is to that. And we see it all across culture, from the Bible to Hermetic philosophy to ancient Egypt. We see it everywhere. And that's kind of what my work is regarding. Um, so please feel free to stop on by and check out my channel or friend me on Facebook.
Well, great, man. Well, I'll continue looking at your material, and as I learn more, hopefully I'll be able to, ask you better questions down the line. And it's been neat chatting, and I appreciate you kind of sharing your insight.
Sure, Niles. Well, thanks a lot for having me on.
Even Hermes was aware that there is nothing more dismal than unemployment, and therefore that the mind, escaping from the burden of ignorance with the duties and employments which it bestows, does not escape into free space merely to become a vagrant, merely to wander around thinking about things and enjoying thought of itself forever. The mind, having escaped from unprofitable labor, chooses profitable labor. Having departed from unworthy procedures, moves victoriously into worthy ones. Thus the mind can never be idle. It can never rest. It must always move, and in its motion it must always be adventuring toward the solution of mystery. Hermes then points out that there is no mystery except the mystery of ignorance, and that everything mysterious is merely something not understood, and that it is the end of mind that there shall no longer be mystery, that there shall be no question that is not answered, no riddle that is not solved. This concept Hermes carries also to another level, namely the power of mind in the sense of its imaging propensity, that the mind is not only capable of perpetuation and self-discipline and all of this type of thing, it is capable of a procreative process. In other words, mind is capable of giving birth. And in the description of this process in the medieval Hermetic tracts, we find many things that could well be attributed to an earlier date. The idea of the creation of the Hermetic androgyne, the mind as father and mother of itself, the mind as a kind of Melchizedek, a priest forever, and that the power of the mind to create between its own positive and negative polarities, or its male and female principles, brought together through what the alchemists call the Hermetic marriage, that from this is born the homunculus, or the crystal being, the infant that is made of glass, born within a womb of glass, and like Merlin possessed of all kinds of magic. This homunculus is the symbol of man's innate creativity. The mind is not exhausted either in learning or beholding or administering. The mind is not exhausted in the perpetuation of knowledge. Its final function is not to take that which has been known, become aware of it, and pass it on as that which shall be known. This does not exhaust the power of mind. The power of mind includes the possibility of a direct creativity. And it is because of this creativity that the world does not remain the same. It is because of this creativity that the world is not merely the same kind of a garden forever. It is because of this same creativity by which the skilled gardener can improve the quality of plants, so man can improve the quality of self. And furthermore, he can creatively project from the known, creating within himself tremendous instruments of imagination. These instruments of imagination have to have a validity. Imagination is not the individual actually freely generating something from nothing. Imagination is not merely a conjuring of a web of insubstantial fabric. There can be no creativity without law. There can be no procreation of mind unless the image, the created thing, the new creature, is lawful. Thus, although the mind may engage in flights of fantasy beyond our conception, we have the extraordinary record that the fancies of one generation are the sober facts of the next.